There's lots of names for a sensor in television cameras, you know. It's a sensor, an imager, an image sensor, a CCD, a CMOS, a VCT, an image dissector, an iconoscope. It could be film, it could be an image orthicon, a vidicon, a plumicon, depending on what kind of camera you have. But whenever I say sensor, I'm referring to the device that picks up the light in your camera. In most cases, it's going to be a CMOS now. Could be a CCD, could be, you know, a vidicon, but in this case right now, especially in a DSLR, you're going to be looking at a CMOS. As aperture opens up, your depth of field decreases. The plane of focus becomes narrow. Okay, these are general rules. And I'm telling you, you know, whenever you're doing this cinematic shooting, get an ND filter. Variable 1 would be better. All lenses, most lenses actually, when you're getting like a lens like I have for this Canon here, you know, and this is a relatively inexpensive Canon lens, you know, and I bought the Nikon lenses. They're actually, I have a little bit better luck with those, Zeiss lenses, and you know, we want to talk about the types of lenses, you know, but as aperture opens up with low f-stops, your depth of field becomes narrow, and then all lenses generally produce their sharpest image when aperture is set at least 2 steps below wide open. Why? Because that's closer to the area where the lens was designed to work in a zoom lens. You see, this is a zoom lens here. Now, how do I know it's a zoom lens? Because I can adjust this and see how the lens becomes longer. Okay, I can either shoot a wider shot or a more narrow shot depending on how I zoom in on what I'm shooting. And that's a zoom lens. And so there's two basic kinds of lenses. I'm getting ahead of myself. There's a zoom lens and there's a prime lens. A zoom lens, you know, basically gives you the ability to zoom in on something. A prime lens is fixed. Okay? Prime lenses can give you a better picture than a zoom lens because they're designed as just a plain basic lens, and all you have are certain adjustments for that, but you can't zoom with it. And so with zoom lenses and with prime lenses, you want the aperture to be set at least 2 stops below wide open. Okay, now remember video, we talked about video at the beginning, is a sequence of stills created by scanning, okay? That's why you want to be mindful of what you're shooting. If you're shooting, film rate was 24, television rate is 30, so when you're shooting for film, you want to be shooting at film speed. In the old days, motion picture cameras had a spinning disc, and this disc had slots in it called shutters, and the size of the slot and the rotational speed determined the light hitting the film, okay? And this was what caused us to have frame dissection in film. And in a DSLR, which DSLR stands for digital single lens reflex, and so that's, you know, the old cameras, the old film cameras that were just plain old picture cameras were single lens reflexes, and then when we put a digital sensor in where the film used to be, it became a digital single lens reflex camera, and so they electronically measure the shutter speed as a fraction of time. So in the old SLR or in the old film camera, you had a spinning disc that would let light just pop in for a fraction of time. Well, and in a SLR, it would open just for a second. The shutter would open just for less than a second, a fraction of a second, and that would expose the film. Well, in a DSLR, we do this electronically, okay? Shutter speed affects exposure. Slowing down the shutter speed increases exposure, the amount of light hitting the sensor. In this case, the amount of time the sensor is turned on in a DSLR. Thus, the sensor imager is allowed to capture more light for a longer period of time when you slow down the shutter speed, or the time the sensor is turned on in a DSLR. However, what I'm telling you is, you want to actually, if you're shooting for television or shooting for film, try and match the shutter speed that's native to that, except for the case if you want to do slow motion photography or high speed photography, in which case you can change the shutter speed because you're trying to do a special effect of slow motion or high-speed photography. Shutter speed affects motion blur, and motion blur is a streaking or smearing when things move. Higher shutter speeds have less motion blur and are also better for slow motion video reproduction, you know. But the thing is, when you're just shooting regular video, try to keep it at the speed that your camera's doing for film or for television, 30 or 40, 50 or 60. 50 for film, 60 for television. So because frame rate and shutter speed are related, okay? Shutter speed is twice the frame rate. For instance, motion pictures have a standard frame rate at 24 frames a second. Shutter speed would then be our 1/48th shutter speed. But most DSLRs don't have a 1/48 shutter speed, so you move it up to 50. Okay, which is slightly better for flicker perception and television, and 30, it's even better for television with flicker perception, which would be 60 fields per second, which is 1/60th shutter speed for television. Now what's flicker? Okay. When Thomas Edison started working with the motion picture camera, they discovered there was a point where the speed of the image as it was being flashed in front of your eye, there was a point where your eye couldn't determine it as flicker anymore. And so when you went above the flicker rate, you didn't see flicker anymore in your eye. Now 24 frames per second flashed twice from a projector allowed a motion picture to be continuous to the human eye without having any flicker. In television, we moved it up to 30 times a second, shown in two fields, or basically flashed twice in two fields. So one frame made in two fields of half of lines, and then the other half of lines in two fields. But basically it's flashing at 60. That's still way above the flicker rate, which is around 22 for the human eye. And so either of these ways we were allowed to see a continuous image rather than a bunch of flashing pictures, okay? And so that's what the flicker rate's about. And it's really not a good idea to use your shutter speed to control exposure, because basically you're decreasing the amount of time that your sensor is turned on, and consequently you're just opening yourself up for motion artifacts and motion blur and problems, you know, unless of course you want to shoot a slow motion. And if you want to shoot a slow motion, then you move your shutter speed up to around 100 or above, like a 1/125 or 1/120. But you got that trade-off whenever you're doing your high-speed shutter. You're going to be getting into motion artifacts, and you can either use the motion artifacts for what you're wanting to do and make them part of the way you're painting your image, the artistic way you're shooting, or if you're not paying attention to that, you can actually create a problem you can't get out of.